Despite all of that which has happened, very few have given up much at all. How has this fear of rebellion or action seemingly crippled us to the point where there are very, very few examples, whether it's from our scholars or activists, who are willing to put almost anything on the line, it feels?
I think it's important for us to acknowledge that fear is a natural part of human behavior. It's what keeps us safe, it's what keeps us alive. And even in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has just given Musa alayhi salam the message, Surah Taha, what is Musa alayhi salam's first response? It is, I'm afraid of what Fir'aun and his people will do to me. He's saying that if I go and say the things that you're asking me to say, I'm worried about what will happen to me by doing so. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reassures him, of course, being afraid is not the problem. The problem is, of course, how that fear is attached to our position, our wealth, our lives, which is where the connection to the dunya comes in. That's what the fear is connected to, losing the things that we have. And the question is, how do we get past that? Victory in the Quran is not presented as material success. At no point does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when you have enough numbers and you have an overwhelming resources, then I will grant you the victory. It's always like the exact opposite, that despite your limited numbers, despite your lack of resources, that I will grant you victory based on what? Based on taqwa. That is what we are presented with. Then we have to ask ourselves, who is at most risk of Allah's punishment on Yawm al-Qiyamah? I may be even willing to argue that even though Egypt and Jordan are closer geographically to Palestine, that we are still in the West more burdened by the role that the West plays in maintaining Zionism, okay, in relation to our proximity to our governments, the taxes that we pay, the financial entanglements between our governments and the Zionist one, than your average Egyptian person or Jordanian person, because of the role that their governments and their military play in inhibiting their ability to be able to act.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters, friends all over the world, and welcome to another episode of the Stand for Palestine podcast. We are very, very delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us again. We hope very much that you're enjoying the first part of our series of conversations and interviews that we're having with esteemed guests, both locally in Australia and from around the world. I'm very, very delighted to welcome someone today who I think is a very important part of what is a critical conversation, which comes at the heart of this genocide. We're not sure at what phase in the genocide we're having this conversation, because we are told that things are close to an end, but really we never seem to quite get there. So Allah knows best. He's someone who needs very little introduction, but I think has a very, very important contribution. And indeed, today's topic and title is so timely, because we consistently need to question what we are doing and whether we have done enough. And so the idea of why Muslims must learn to disobey is something that we'll explore with Dr. Asim Qureshi. Dr. Asim is the research director at CAGE and the author of A Virtue of Disobedience, which is very much the crux of our topic today. I'll actually ask him a little bit about his work to start with. So I won't go too far into his very prolific work, mashallah, in this space. Brother Asim, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu rahmatullah. How are you doing?
How are you? How are things? I wouldn't say on the other side of the pond, on the other side of many ponds and many, many continents in between.
Yeah, and alhamdulillah, everything's okay here. Obviously there's a lot of difficulties, but we're also, building movements here and really coming together and challenging what's taking place, especially for Gaza. So I think, it is a time, it's an important time. It's a time for a great deal of reflection on many of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercies. So yeah, alhamdulillah, that we're here, right, and able to do this work.
Absolutely. In an absolute nutshell, for those who may have been living under a rock, how would you describe sort of your work? Tell us a little bit quickly about CAGE, some of your work, and a little bit of the history of CAGE prisoners, which many of us grew up with as a sort of like a beacon of activism and Islamically rooted resistance to the war and terror status quo.
And Jazakallah khair. So CAGE, as you mentioned, started off as CAGE prisoners. It was a response to political detentions in the global war on terror, particularly at the prison island of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where hundreds of Muslim men were being detained without charge. They were being tortured by the US military. And so, we go from that, which is, these very, very extreme political detentions, to realizing that actually there's political detentions in a post 9/11 world taking place all over the world. And so, we traveled around, we met with the families of many people who were detained. We advocated on their behalves. And this is really where Cage International is born from. More recently, of course, we've gotten heavily involved in Palestine because we're seeing so many detentions taking place because of those who are standing up for Palestine. So really, Cage International comes out of a response to the global war on terror and the policies that were enacted. And the role that alhamdulillah I've been able to play is to really help those who have been most impacted by these egregious policies.
Alhamdulillah. And what is the current focus in a nutshell of Cage? Like, what is the work that you're doing in the midst of the Gaza issue, for example?
So, I mean, there's just so many elements to what we're doing. Where bringing cases in relation to Hamas, for instance, in the UK, and how that impacts on our freedom of expression. We have filed complaints against Zionist legal organizations, charities who ostensibly support Zionism from the UK. We've been supporting those who are being detained because of their involvement in direct action, shutting down weapons factories, trying to support them. And more recently, you might have seen, even our senior director, Brother Marzenberg, who was a former Guantanamo Bay detainee himself, get arrested purposefully, knowingly arrested for breaching the Terrorism Act by effectively expressing his support for the banned organization Palestine Action alongside hundreds and hundreds of other people. So, there's a range of work that's going on, but most of it, is around trying to support those who are advocating on behalf of Palestine.
Absolutely. Let's dive into today's topic proper. I guess, your work in the midst of this this horrific genocide that's going on, recently has become a sort of, point of discussion. Some of the themes are being discussed perhaps a little more broadly than they were previously, as the intensity of what's going on gets worse and worse. The first thing I want to talk about with you is, we've seen this absolute monstrosity play out literally in real time, in a way that perhaps it has not happened before. And yet, we find ourselves questioning what more can we do? And there's something that holds us back. There's something inherently as Muslims that I think is holding a lot of us back, even those of us who are involved in activism and are very, very active in this particular space. And that is this sort of fear of rebellion. And, for me, there are themes here of a loss, a fear of loss of our statuses, our freedoms, our jobs. And, it comes to a point where you start wondering, you typically build some of these moats up around yourself in life for use at a certain time. Like, there will be a certain time at which you'll be willing to give it all. But you almost wonder, like, how much worse could things get before many people who seem committed to the cause of Palestine, of this ummah, whatever the case may be, are willing to let go of that. And yet, despite all of that which has happened, very few have given up much at all. How do you understand this? How do we understand this? How has this fear of rebellion or action seemingly crippled us to the point where there are very, very few examples, whether it's from our scholars or activists or whatever, who are willing to put almost anything on the line, it feels. Like, there are very slim pickings in terms of examples. What is going on with the collective Muslim psyche, whether it's in the West, perhaps even in our ummah more generally? How do you sort of make sense of this?
Jazakallah khair. I think this is a really important and profound question. I don't have any easy answers to this. I think that's important for us to recognize. I think this is something that there is a lot at interplay with a question like that in terms of our collective psychology. What is it that has resulted in a situation where many Muslims feel helpless? And it's true that they do. Ultimately, the violence of the state, of many states, is ubiquitous, and that carries consequence in the lives of people. And it's not just over here in the UK. It's anywhere in the world, really. So what do we do with that? Because, you know, Muslims don't have a safe haven anywhere in the world. There's no country that you could point to and say they would protect the rights of the one who is standing up for Islam in its entirety. Like, there will always be some type of, you know, kind of potential problem that might emerge by truly trying to advocate for the fullness of Islam as a religion. Because, of course, in order to advocate for Islam's fullness, one would have to do away with the state itself in many ways. You know, so we're left with a conundrum. Like, how do we express ourselves? But the question, you know, ultimately is, you know, what is it about us individually that is holding us back? Okay, we understand that at a structural level, maybe we can't organize ourselves in the way that we might like, that we don't have power and authority that is willing to back a stronger stance. But, you know, could we do things at an individual level? And if the answer to that is yes, that you know, you can and you should do things at an individual level, then what is holding us back at that individual level? And, you know, I was
Is
thinking,
that something? Sorry to interrupt. Is that something you think of a lot yourself? Like, is that a question you ask yourself constantly?
yeah, all the time. Like, my wife knows. I think one of the hardest things that I struggle with is feeling like a hypocrite in, you know, especially over these last 2 years. I mean, I feel like that a lot generally anyway. That, you know, am I doing enough? You know, have I really, you know, maximized what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me to, you know,
Subhanallah.
the nth degree? And I think that if we're able to answer that question, then I think that we've probably got the wrong idea about what our role is. I think we should feel like that. I think all of us should feel like that all the time. I think that until the matter is at an end, that if any of us are resting on any laurels, then we've already lost what it is that we were supposed to be, what we were supposed to be doing with this dunya that we've been given, with this life that we've been, with these resources that we've been given. And so that is, I think, the thing for us to worry about. And I always come back to these two tracts that both come from the mid 1500s, actually. One is written by a European philosopher whose name was Etienne de la Boétie, called The Politics of Obedience. And the other was by a Sha'arani, a Sufi scholar, also from the mid 1500s, who wrote a book on, you know, kind of cowardly jurists and gullible mendicants, where he's critiquing those who get close to power. And both of them are effectively saying the same thing, which is that it is a love of the dunya that stops you from being able to be true to your covenant to Allah. Of course, Etienne de la Boétie is speaking about a much more kind of a political, psychological level, whereas Ash'arani is like calling it out. And he says it explicitly. He says that if you have any love for this dunya in the heart, don't get close to power, don't befriend emirs, because that love of the dunya will corrupt you completely. It will corrupt that relationship. You won't be able to hold that friendship to account in the way that you need to. And, you know, the love of the dunya element isn't just a love of the dunya, it's also a fear of what the dunya might do to you. Like, it's your attachment to the dunya that is what he's talking about. And so the question that we have for ourselves is, what is this attachment that we have? What is it based on? And why is it that we're not willing to overcome that attachment out of a fear of the unknowable? Because, you know, ultimately, it's in the space of the unknowable that, you know, we don't act. Like, we don't know what the consequence of what we do on the other side is. You know, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that fear is a natural part of human behavior. It's what keeps us safe. It's what keeps us alive. You know, back in the day, like, you know, if you were living in the jungle and, you know, you saw a snake that was very venomous and very deadly, your fear response is what keeps you alive in that moment and helps you to either fight it or run away from it. It's necessary. And even in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has just given Musa alayhi salam the message, Surah Taha, what is Musa alayhi salam's first response? It is, I'm afraid of what Fir'aun and his people will do to me. right? Very first response is a fair response. He's saying that, if I go and say the things that you're asking me to say, I'm worried about what will happen to me by doing so. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reassures him, of course, right? And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the fair response is not one that is a condemnatory response. It's okay to feel afraid of the world that we live in.
Is it possible that for some people that the fear is separate to the hub ad-dunya, the love of the dunya? Is it possible that they are separate things? Or do you really feel that you can only really be afraid if there is some attachment to the dunya? Because there are some people who say, I have no love for this dunya at all. I'm just afraid of something. I'm afraid of what might happen to my family, to myself, my well-being. It's not because I love the dunya. I dislike it. I despise it. But are you saying that psychologically they're really one and the same? They're sort of collapsed into the one, and we haven't unpeeled it in that case psychologically to be at that position where there's something still holding us back?
I mean, look, as I said, the fair response is a normal response. It's a natural response. It is a physiological response in many ways. You'd be stupid not to be afraid of something that might cause you harm. And neither should we seek harm or wish it upon ourselves, right? We're specifically told not to wish harm upon ourselves. But in certain circumstances, you have to accept that doing the right thing might carry consequences from you. And that is a story from the beginning of the Quran through to the end. There isn't a moment where that's not presented. The magicians of Fir'aun are told explicitly that Fir'aun says, I will crucify you by cutting off your opposite hand and foot. And they say that, we believe in the Lord of Musa. They accept that this is what's going to happen to them. Being afraid is not the problem. The problem is, of course, how that fear is attached to our position, our wealth, our lives, which is where the connection to the dunya comes in. Which is that what is it that we're afraid of? It's for the sanctity of ourselves. It's the sanctities of our families. It's the sanctity of our wealth. That's what the fear is connected to. Ultimately, losing the things that we have. And the question is, how do we get past that? And I think that is, of course, a very individual thing. You can't get people en masse necessarily to get over their fears immediately. But it's also something that happens through leadership. It's something that happens through example. When people see others being brave, it encourages bravery. But you have to be brave in the first place. You have to show that bravery.
SubhanAllah. So there's two things that I want to sort of ask about this. One is, do you think this is an aspect of our tradition that is underemphasized to start with, right? Number one. And number two is, that point about the examples. And I really want to dive into scholarship and sort of the ulama and the alim class that I know have raised. There has been a bit of controversy around that online. But let's talk about the first of those points first. Do you think that there is an underemphasis on that part of our tradition or on that part of Islam or the Quran and the stories in the Quran, generally speaking? Have we been raised, whether by accident or deliberately, as a people who focus on and emphasize the obedience part of allegiance to leadership or to the tradition, as opposed to the part that caused great figures in our tradition to rise up? And we should definitely quickly mention a couple of those. I'd be interested to see how you attack the first of those questions firstly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you take the two prevailing large state-sponsored currents, one of Salafism and one of New Traditionalism, they're both very much tied to this idea of obedience, regardless of what the ta'ah looks like, right? And to whom. I remember like the early 2000s being told by Salafis in the UK that Tony Blair was Wali al-Amr. Very seriously, they were saying this stuff and very much believing it, that, he is who you owe a ta'ah to. And it was such a bizarre argument. And ultimately, it came down to a theology of obedience that, is about maintaining the status quo. Now, of course, there's lots and lots and lots that's been written about, well, what happens on the other side if, you're not obedient, what is the consequences of that? What happens if you're rebellious? And the reality is that what we are being asked to be obedient towards is a system and a structure of capitalism and neoliberalism that is so destructive, that is the most destructive force that this earth has ever seen. And I cannot imagine that Allah's irada for us on the earth is to just simply exist inside it. That, حتى اليوم القيامة, like until the day of judgment, this is the final manifestation of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us as Muslims to exist in the world. Like, it can't be.
And it's almost like when you analogize to the seerah, it's almost like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam could not have accepted that, and Musa alayhi salam and Ibrahim alayhi salam could not have accepted that, that the prevalent way that humanity lives is in subservience to false gods and idols who are worshipped besides Allah. Isn't that really at the core of it the sort of the prevailing message of Tawheed in some ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always come back to this question being one of Tawheed, right? Like, if we go from the beginning of the Quran to the end of the Quran, and you look at every single story in the Quran where people are in difficulty and coming up against an oppressive power, the story is never from beginning to end that compromise your faith, hide your faith for the sake of maintaining your safety, right? The answer is always, or the example that we are always given is that you are courageous in that moment, that you express, you have tawakkul on Allah, that you really place your reliance upon Him alone in order to set an example for others, in order to be victorious. And that's the thing. Victory in the Quran is not presented as material success. At no point does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say that when you have enough numbers and you have overwhelming resources, then I will grant you the victory. It's always like the exact opposite, that despite your limited numbers, despite your lack of resources, that I will grant you victory based on what? Based on taqwa. That is what we are presented with consistently in the Quran. The question is, what does taqwa look like in the world that we live in right now? How do we have a praxis of taqwa, like a tawheed that is actually seen and understood, as opposed to a tawheed that is just simply taught in books, but isn't actually, that understanding of la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, exactly, that is manifested.
Yeah, and like in some ways, and maybe it is the prevailing milieu of capitalism that does this to us, this idea of what the good life is, the life that we are told to aspire to and build towards. And there's like a linear progression of childhood and play, and then education, and then, attainment of rank and wealth, and then passing that on to the next generation. There's almost like this linear trajectory that life is meant to have. And somewhere within that, your religion can be there. And, under these state co-opted sort of bastardizations of Islam, that might look like being knowledgeable. That might look like being, very well grounded in Islam, theoretically even. But that's the sort of the trajectory of life that has been built. And this idea of the sunnah of Allah, which is that struggle, is at the core of life. And in fact, for you to like almost in this day and age, especially with capitalism having the control over it that it does, that if something doesn't go wrong in life, you should be questioning. That if you haven't sacrificed something, and I think this is the hardest part, Brother Asim, for me, as far as I'm concerned, from what I see, and myself being a middle class sort of subcontinental Muslim, and I think you probably share that background, and you've seen your elders and your sort of youth in Britain and so forth, or at least been exposed to such communities. That's what they're aspiring to, and so to reject that and to work against that and go against that grain is almost in some ways like breaking an idol in some way, isn't it? It's really turning your back on something that's been programmed into you. And that's why I think it's so hard. Like, it's not an easy thing to realize that this is actually the sunnah of life. It's not to build towards this good life. It's actually to completely reject it. And that's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing for all of us. And I don't want to I don't want to diminish the anxiety that people feel. I think it's only right and proper that people do feel that, and I don't think people should be condemned, like Musa alayhi salam, for having that feeling in their heart that, oh my God, this is super scary, and I have to really think about what the consequence of what this might have on my life and my ability to function and operate and whatever the case might be. But at the same time, not acting against your own interests in some ways goes against the very spirit of what we're told in the Quran. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in numerous places, don't you think that you will be tested like those before you were tested? In other places, don't you think you'll be tested like the prophets before you were tested? And if we're to take that seriously, if we take it seriously that don't you think you'll be tested like those of the past or like the prophets, then we have to look at their examples specifically and ask ourselves, okay, well, if they were being tested in certain ways, what does that look like for us right now? And if we think about, something like a genocide, if you're not thinking about, those who were killed by the people of the ditch, right? If you're not thinking about the magicians of Fir'aun, if you're not thinking about those who were enslaved by Fir'aun, then what are the examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking about?
Subhanallah.
Like, I
Absolutely.
can't think of what that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means when he's telling us that I'm going to test you like those of the past. And then we say, well, those examples aren't relevant to us. That can't be right. It can't be right at all.
It really is like a very deep philosophical reassessment of our place in the modern world in light of our deen, isn't it? Like this is asking people to really paradigmatically question where they're at, really at the core of their Islam. And it often takes these calamities to do this to us. And I think this is happening to a lot of people. We've heard of a lot of people sisters who put on the hijab because of Gaza, people who started practicing their deen because they realized it's just mind-boggling what these people are being put through, and yet their resilience and their commitment and attachment to their deen and their willingness to give up everything, literally, for a life of dignity, for a life of justice and freedom. And yet, what are we worried about? Our mortgages and our degrees and so forth. It really, really is a wake-up call and a slap in the face.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that second issue that I was speaking about, which was, then we've got the Qur'anic worldview and how this is meant to be understood in our tradition. Then we've got the absence or the presence or the importance of role models that model that sort of behavior. And that's where I sort of want to come to a current conversation that's happening within certain circles. And, it's been a discussion that's been happening online, and I know you're familiar with it. And I want to just use that as a bit of a departure point, not to dwell on controversy, which we all love a little bit of, but, as just an example of a live conversation. So recently there, alhamdulillah, you've been sort of like a great proponent of this topic and have had multiple conversations with multiple hosts, Islam 21C, Brother Jalal from The Thinking Muslim and so forth. And this constant topic of our scholars not doing enough has been a discussion point. And then recently, Brother Jalal from The Thinking Muslim also brought on a guest, Dr. Farha, and she discussed this point. And there was quite a severe reaction to this online. It was essentially a critique of scholars as a genus, as a class of people, in terms of their shortcoming in the Gaza moment, if we want to call it that, when it comes to their responsibility to speak out, to lead the ummah, on a path of resistance, a courageous resistance and leadership. You've been sort of quite vocal on this topic, and I want to explore this one with you a little bit. But before we do, what do you make of that almost visceral reaction that's happened? What have you heard? What have you seen? And how do you process that? Like, what does it indicate of our collective condition in the Muslim communities in the West that this has largely taken place in?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I saw many responses to the podcast between Dr. Farah and Jalal. I thought it was a good conversation. I enjoyed it. I benefited from it personally. I'm also the type of person who will listen to and read things, especially books, and it might be an absolutely garbage book, but I will always go away from it thinking about the things that I take that have improved me as a person, or have improved my thinking, or maybe gave me an insight into something that I hadn't thought of before. So even if I don't like a book or appreciate it or like a podcast, there might be something that I take away from it, and that's the thing that I hold on to. And so I think because of that, just the way that I interact with different types of media and information sources perhaps skews my thinking a little bit, because I'm always just looking for, okay, well, how does this improve me? How does this benefit me in some way? And so I think everyone right now should be feeling a sense of, what have I done? Have I done enough? And I think that, when questions are asked in public in particular, I think it's normal for people to react and respond in ways that do feel personal, because we're all struggling with this. And that's why, like, when people get upset at this type of content being out there, I think that's okay too, because because everyone's struggling with it. It's really, really struggling with it. And I don't want to, like, be too condemnatory, because Allahu alam, like, I'm seen as, like, at the end of more radical politics in the UK, but I'm also, like, part of an organization, institution, and infrastructure that allows me to be that way too. So, if I worked in a corporate job, for instance, would I be the same as I am right now? I don't know. Like, I don't know, because I've never had to contend with that. I've never had to contend with being answerable to a masjid committee, because the people that I work with, they push me to exercise my ethics in the public space regardless of consequences. So I think that people are constantly asking questions of themselves, and if they have visceral reactions to these types of conversations, in some ways it's a good thing, because it means that they feel a sense of ownership of that issue. They feel a sense of, like, of implication by that issue, and so I think we can take some confidence in the community that even if it wasn't the content that they were looking for, that it evoked a response, which shows that we're all connected to the cause in some way. And I actually think that's a good starting point to move forward from. If we kind of like take a half glass full approach to it.
I love the way you've handled that. Very empathetic, and perhaps trying to understand the other perspective. So that's one thing then, in terms of how people responded. What about the substance of your thoughts on this particular issue? Let's get into the crux of that. What do you think is the responsibility of scholars, in as succinct a form as you can, in this moment? Like, what would you want to see? Factoring for all these things that you just mentioned, which is that they've got pressures that exist, and you may not be able to fully appreciate them, which I think is fantastic. Like, just knowing that at a human level is important. Notwithstanding that, surely there's a bar that they should be held to, right? What would be your thoughts on that? What is that bar, and what would we expect, or what would our tradition want us to see from scholars in this sort of moment, in this very unique historical moment?
Yeah, jazakallah khair. So I think scholars have, by and large, the probably the vast majority of them, done what is minimally required of them, which is to do khutbahs on Palestine, which is to talk about it, which is to come to the demonstrations. I think they've done those things. They made dua for Palestine. And I don't, I don't hold this against them. I think it's really amazing that, we have a community that is willing to say and do all of these things. But I guess I'm left with questions about what their role and function is, because of the things that I see that I think could do with a degree of intervention from a scholarly class. So, for example, today, inshallah, later this evening, I'm going to go and visit a 20-year-old sister who smashed up drones and quadcopters, or alleged to, I should say, have smashed up drones and quadcopters at an Elbit Systems factory, which produces the vast majority of drone material that is used by the Zionist occupation forces against the Gazans. Now, she has stopped these machines from leaving the UK, where she lives, where we all live, and where a lot of, like, obviously Muslim scholars live. she stopped those machines leaving from the UK to go and kill other Muslims. Now, obviously, at Cage, we're supporting her. We're playing our role in relation to helping the prisoners, as is our duty. But do the scholars have something to say about this? Is my question. Like, are they in this moment? Are they obliged to say something about her action that informs us all about the Islamic boundaries of this, or even just a
and I
moment of
guess
spiritual support, right? Because there are Muslims inside those prisons. There are guards who are telling her that what she did is wrong. They have absolutely no reason to be saying these things to her whatsoever, but they're trying to basically like spiritually gaslight her to say that, oh, what are you doing? I attend the protest. Why can't you just protest like the rest of us? But here is somebody who's literally stopped a machine to Gaza to kill our people. So, and so far, and we have many, many, many brilliant scholars here in the UK. I don't think I've seen a single press release, fatwa, article by a single scholar in the traditional sense speaking about what's happening to these brothers and sisters, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who are being locked up for taking part in this action. And of course, there are actual Muslim sisters and Muslim brothers who are locked up right now for taking part, or alleged to have been taking part in this action. So what is their status? What is yeah?
Is this sort of detached from the issue of Palestine Action being now a proscribed organization, support for whom could be seen as supporting terrorism? So you're saying even before this?
Well, we'll get to that in a second.
Don't see enough work. Yeah.
We'll get to that in a second, but I'm just talking about this action itself. Forget about Palestine Action. The Filton 24, which obviously we're still campaigning for. We're talking about it publicly. It was an action that took place before Palestine Action was banned. I am publicly talking about the Filton 24. I'm legally trained. The lawyers that I work with are all legally trained. And yet we're being told that somehow scholars understand the law better than we are, which is why they are not speaking about these things. That can't be right.
Is that a justification that you hear in the community?
It's a justification I've heard from some people, not everybody. I obviously I haven't done a full survey of what all scholars are saying in the UK regarding this, but the few that I've spoken to are telling me that they are concerned about the legal implications. Like, bro, I'm publicly speaking about this stuff. I'm involved in it. I'm helping these people. I'm helping their families. And you're telling me that you understand the law better than I do? You understand the law better than their lawyers do? Than their families do? And so the question is then, like, okay, then what are you basing this on if you're not basing it on actual legality? And then it comes to where I think that the problem lies, which is it's not the right moment, it's not the right time, or we don't have the power to be able to see it. It's not the right context. It's difficult in our institutions. Okay, now we come to a different matter, right? So it's not a legal matter anymore. It's a matter of politically what we are willing to do to take risks. So some people will say, well, the Charity Commission will come down on us. Okay, that's fine. You say the Charity Commission will come down and will investigate you. But the lawyers, the people who are legally trained in this area, are telling you that you can make an intervention in this area without falling foul of the law and within the confines of what the Charity Commission allows. So then why are you not doing it now? Because they're worried about the investigation. And so when you start unpicking it bit by bit by bit, right, you realize that so much of the lack of involvement doesn't come from a reading of what is legally okay or not. It is about what people are willing to politically stomach. Because it's not about let's start the highest level. It's not about the ethics of the religion itself, right? It's not about that, because that is the easy one, which is, this is ethical. This is right. This is what should be required. Okay, but they have made an intervention there. It's definitely not about what the law is, because the people who understand the law are telling you exactly, what is and isn't okay at this time. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not out there kind of, expressing support for any proscribed organization. Okay.
Mm.
So that's the second level. And then the last level then we get to is like, okay, so what is this based on? And then it comes back to the very first conversation that we started at the beginning,
Yes, absolutely.
which is
Absolutely.
the fear of the unknown, and not having the I would say the mettle to take on the charity commission for trying to inhibit our ability to express ourselves fully. Like, for example, even with the Hamas case that I worked on with Riverway Law, but Brother Fahad Ansari, who brought it, we're being told that this is legally a very difficult thing for Muslim scholars to get behind and to back and to talk about. I mean, again, you're talking to us about what legally is and isn't possible.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. We're telling you, we're informing you that this is actually something that you can do, that this is something that you can talk about, that we have provided you with all the tools that you need to speak about, this application to prescribe the organization. And alhamdulillah, we did. In that case, we had Sheikh Haytham al-Haddad and Dr. Uthman Latif, two very, senior people that we respect in this country, kind of writing expert reports for the application. But that's two people. There's two people out of hundreds that we have. And of course now we have hundreds of people willing, non-Muslims, the vast majority, and a few Muslims, just a handful of Muslims, willing to allow for themselves to be arrested under Section 13 of the Terrorism Act for holding up placards that say, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action, right? Including, of course, my own colleague Mazen Beg. Now, okay, again, nobody's asking you to get involved in the action directly. Well, I mean, actually, no, I shouldn't say that. We are asking you, okay? But if you can't bring yourself to that, could you turn up? Could you just turn up just to show that there is solidarity here, that fine, the non-Muslims are taking the lead and are putting themselves on the front line and are willing to get themselves arrested, like some of them octogenarians. Is there an Islamic reason for you to turn up and show your solidarity for them? I would argue that probably there is, Allahu Alam. But and the question is, okay, if you're not turning up, why are you not turning up? What are the reasons? And again, it's not legal, because turning up to show your solidarity to those getting arrested is not a legal problem.
SubhanAllah. So there is something. So there's something deeper going on, and that's, I guess, the crux of our conversation today, and where we sort of started this discussion, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, look, it's what can you say? What can you say? Where do you think? At what point do you think it's an abdication of the responsibility of scholars if they do not lead us in this way? Like, could there come a point? And I mean, you just wonder how much worse it can get. But we've thought that many times in the last 24, 22 months. How much worse can it get? And it has gotten worse. And now we are on the cusp of a famine, which is only being, I mean, the famine is here, but the mass death due to it is only being averted because of very carefully drip-fed aid that comes in, which prevents thousands of dying from it, as opposed to the dozens or hundreds that we've seen so far. Does there come a point, do you think, where you'd be prepared, for example, to make much stronger comments than what you have now? Like, I still feel that there is a little bit there that you're, leaving in the tank, so to speak. Mashallah, very polite and very diplomatic. Where is the point at which it becomes like, no, this is it. Like, this is an abdication of scholarly responsibility. This is not what the tradition was about. Imam Abu Hanifa, Ibn Taymiyyah, etc., etc., etc. This is the responsibility of scholars to speak the truth, even if it costs them their life. We haven't reached that point yet, have we? Or have we? Like, what do you think if you compare back to the greats of our tradition?
Allahu Alam, akhi. I think we as a community have abdicated so much. And I'm not just talking about scholars here. I'm talking about all of us.
And maybe that's what it is.
Our political projects
hold them to account either. Yeah.
Right. We have to hold ourselves to account, right? And they are us. They are part of us. They are, I think the reason why it cuts deeply, right, is because for those of us who grew up in a different time where we weren't taking our learning from YouTube celebrities, Scholars are extremely important. They are the ones that we love. We have this reverence for Islamic knowledge
Yes.
because that's how we learn. We learn at the feet of others, and we see them as people who, warasatul anbiya, like they hold the mantle of the prophets. That's what
The
we've been
paragons.
taught,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, like for me personally, I feel super invested in scholarship that is strong, that is independent, that is brave, that is courageous, and I want to follow that. I don't want, people might admire me, they might admire my work and whatever else, but people won't follow me, and neither do I want them to follow me, right? I'm an expert in certain areas that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me the opportunity and burdened me with a certain set of knowledge that I have to use for a certain specific reason, right? I know that about myself. The expertise comes with burden.
Yeah.
What I want is I want to follow, and I want other people to follow ulama who can give us guidance throughout this entire process of holding the world to account, because there is no single political structure that I trust to be able to do that. I want the entire world to be reformed. Something as simple as having somebody that I can look up to has a vision, has a desire, expresses that public desire to end riba in the world, right? I want to follow someone like that. I want that person to exist who says that, like, fine, I don't know how I'm going to do it right now, but I'm telling you now that, like, one of my great goals in life is to end riba in the world. I have this irada, that I have this intention, that I have that desire to end one of the chief movers of injustice around the entire globe. Okay, so where do these people exist, and how can we follow them, right? And I honestly, that is what I'm looking for. Or are we to just wait for the Mahdi? Is that what our ulama are telling us, that look, the world is structurally violent in so many different ways, right? Like neoliberalism, capitalism is ubiquitous. We can't do anything about the financial system. We can't do anything about these things. Our nation states are all of them complicit in a billion manifold ways. They have no desire to see beyond the ethno-nationalist borders that they've created, that like nothing is post-colonial. We are all still in a continuity of colonization, right? And so because we can't do anything about that, the best thing that we can do is to try and worship Allah as best as we can within these extremely violent and complicit and problematic structures until the moment that the Mahdi arrives, and then inshallah everything will change. I mean,
So,
I don't want to wait.
It's an interesting point that you make. Sorry to cut you off. It's an interesting point that you make, right? Do you think, without articulating it that sophisticatedly, that our scholars are telling that to us? Or at least in some cases they are. We know we've heard this from scholars, right? Is that what it is? Is it just a fatalistic sort of giving up of hope in us through our efforts and through our agency being able to change the course of a world that seems so deeply entrenched in a world order that is so completely foreign and subverted by non-Islamic forces, that the idea of being able to change it through the scholarly voice or a couple of good scholarly voices, it just seems so outlandish that it is better to just maintain your practice of Islam at an individual level and wait for the Mahdi. Is that sort of what's going on here, perhaps in some quarters?
Allahu alam. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Look, just even the relationship that we have, say, for example, with the Gulf countries, who have been exercising a grand larceny of the Ummah's resources since their inception, right? Over the last 100 years, they have expropriated and stolen the collective wealth of this Ummah from underneath their feet, and kept it centralized to themselves and to the citizenry of their lands, and wasted it in many different ways on various projects. And then people can point to, say, for example, the Afghan jihad and other moments, right, where money was being spent. Bosnia, where money was being spent. Okay, but let's put that within the context of the wider economics of the projects that they have built throughout the last 100 years. And I think that if we don't come to the conclusion that it's a grand larceny. I don't know what other conclusion we can come to.
Mm.
And so,
Mm.
if that is the case, then what does that mean for the rest of us? Because, you know, are scholars really telling me that Saudi Arabia is not my land? Are they honestly saying to me that that is not my heritage, that that is not something that my children should have every right to travel to, that they should, that they don't have, you know, every right to simply turn up in the Gulf, okay, and consider it their heritage? Because, and I don't think scholars are saying that. I don't think they are.
Mm.
I think what they're saying is that, well, what do you expect us to do? Right?
Yeah.
I think that's what scholars are saying. And that's why, like, you know, I have, you know, admiration for Dr. Omer Anjum and his
Mm.
Ummatics project. You know, I think that, you know, right now, a lot of what they're doing is obviously a very theoretical level, but they've opened the
Mm.
conversation about rethinking it, at least, about
Mm.
asking, what does a political project look like out there? And even if you
Mm.
don't have the answer right now, and I don't, and that's the thing, I don't care about somebody having an absolute blueprint right now, in this second, in this moment, for how we're going to achieve any of this. But the reason why I'm looking to scholars is I want them to say that I have an intention to change it. I have
Mm.
every intention in my own lifetime to see this reversed, right? To see a Muslim world that is not completely subservient to systems of riba. I would love to see that, you know, to
Mm.
see that being proclaimed publicly, but I don't.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
Yeah.
And I know this is
In
a
some
tangent
ways,
to the original
yeah.
conversation, but
No,
I
no,
think
it is,
that
but
the
it's
violence
all
is so
tied together.
ubiquitous,
Yeah.
you know, and then we get trapped in these same you know, paradigms that you know, because we're locked into this system and this culture, right? So we end up in getting involved in culture wars about men and women, relationships, this, that, and the other, when the entire system, okay, does not cater for the needs of what a dignified life looks like. Right, you
Yes,
want to have a
absolutely.
conversation about like brothers divorcing their wives and leaving their wives, their ex-wives destitute and whatever else, but that's the brother's property. So why should he give her anything or whatever else? Okay, within like the Western world that we live in, but we don't have a Beit al-Mal, right? Like
Yes.
if we lived with honor and dignity as men, right? Fine, in an Islamic environment where the Beit al-Mal existed and where just leadership and rulership existed, we would hope, okay, that the Beit al-Mal or Awqaf, right, would exist, would be strong, would be set up, that no one would be left with that feeling of, I have just been abandoned, right?
Mm.
But because we're doing this inside of neoliberalism and capitalism, what we're saying is that, okay, we're going to hold on to the tradition as we understand it within these exceptionally violent structures, and we're going to maintain that. And I'm not saying that like, okay, you know, we have to change Islamic law. What I'm saying is that, like, why don't we have a political structure and an economic structure that allows us to take care of our own, so we don't end up in a culture war that has been produced by the West itself, that is self-cannibalizing itself, okay? And what we do is basically try and fit the tradition into that model.
Mm.
Doesn't make any sense. So like, it's at every level, right? It's
Absolutely.
at the
Yeah.
level of the economic system, it's a level of the political system, and it's at the level of the family itself.
SubhanAllah. I mean, you know, in some ways, these are, you know, the realizations that we're having in this moment again. But I think many of us are probably close to this sort of this problematic of, you know, a world that is mired from its very core, from its very foundations, in a kufri, a very problematic, deep, and all-encompassing sort of mess, which is born out of, you know, a systemic level departure from that which the fitrah is founded upon, which is submission to God, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and adherence to His way of life, which He has ordained. So it is really root and branch, right? And I don't think anyone would disagree when you actually pass it that way, is that that is the root cause of all the problems. I guess the issue becomes one of, well, how do we get out of that? And you've mentioned, you know, sort of projects that are ongoing, and, you know, we're all aware of sort of, you know, the very ambitious projects of the likes of, you know, Hizb ut-Tahrir, you know, with the call for the Khilafah, or the Salafi Mujahideen that have, you know, sort of advocated fighting our way to victory. And of course, you know, we're all sort of seeing the aftermath of perhaps the most successful such project in the modern day, which is the liberation of Syria, for example. And all of those are discussions for another time, but they are very potent and important conversations. I guess the question is, trying to sort of round this out in a way which is respectful of your time as well. What does that mean for you and I, right? What does that mean for you and I in the context of some themes that you've been talking about recently that I'm sort of quite interested in just sort of diving into? You've talked about the end of Zionism, that Zionism is collapsing under its own contradictions. It survives only through Western backing. And we've talked a lot about what is the sort of obligation on scholars to lead from the front to undo this machinery of oppression. I guess the question that I want to bring it back to is one of your core theses, one of the core things that you're interested in, which is the virtue of disobedience, right? What does all of that mean for you and me in this moment that we find ourselves in as individuals? What can we do? Accepting that it's a systemic, very broad problem that perhaps no one individual is going to solve themselves. I mean, if our scholars can't solve it, Faraz isn't going to solve it for sure. But what role does Faraz have, or the average Ahmed, or Fatima, or Ilham, or Abdurrahman, or whatever the case may be? What do these people have of obligation, and what does the idea of disobedience and rebelling, which is the sort of how we're sort of frame today's conversation, which is why Muslims must learn to disobey. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for you and I? And what would you encourage our brothers and sisters to start thinking about or reflecting in terms of what the current moment requires from us, no matter how difficult the situation may seem?
Exactly. So, if we're taking the genocide, kind of as the starting point for this discussion, then we have to ask ourselves what maintains Zionism's presence in the world, right? And what maintains Zionism's presence in the world is effectively the West. Without the West and the backing of the West, Zionism collapses under the weight of its own kind of lunacy. And the two central pillars of the West in supporting Zionism is, of course, the UK and the US. UK, especially historically, but even now. And we're talking about financially, militarily, diplomatically, politically, like all these levels. These two countries are the central nodes in maintaining Zionism's oppression in the world. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves, living in these two countries in particular, but generally across the West, that includes Australia as well, is what does that mean for us? Like, if we were to think about, let's put the entirety of the Muslim Ummah on a map, and then we have gradients of colors for those who are most complicit and least complicit in the Ummah in relation to the genocide, right? So the more, for example, red you get, the more complicit you are, and like at the other end, maybe like a blue or a green or a yellow, you're least complicit. Are we saying that a Muslim woman with a university degree from the UK or the US who has studied international relations or political science, right, is less or more responsible and burdened by what is happening in Gaza than, say, for example, a fisherman off the coast of Somalia or a farmer in Afghanistan? Who is closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment is, I think, the question that we have to ask ourselves based on where we live and our proximity to the violence of the oxygen of what maintains Zionism in the world. I may be even willing to argue that even though Egypt and Jordan are closer geographically to Palestine, that we are still in the West more burdened by the role that the West plays in maintaining Zionism than your average Egyptian person or Jordanian person, because of the role that their governments and their military play in inhibiting their ability to be able to act. So if we accept this, right, that if we see the entirety of the Ummah as a resource, right, and we're looking at two things. The first thing is the level of burden, okay, in relation to our proximity to our governments, the taxes that we pay, the financial kind of entanglements between our governments and the Zionist one, right? So that's the first thing, that the burden that is based on our location. And the second is the burden based on our risk, right? And the risk here, we're translating it as not just like mal, it's not just money, it's not just the wealth that we have, but it's about the intellectual resources that we have, our access to the media, our access to, being able to bring about change in manifold ways. So
everything Allah has endowed us with, really.
Right. So when we consider these two things in relation to where we live, then we have to ask ourselves who is at most risk of Allah's punishment on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And the reason why I believe that we have a responsibility to be rebellious here, to be more courageous here, to sacrifice more from here, is because of that proximity to the violence. Yeah, and I think that is something that if we really reflected on the Quran would come through to most people if they really, really thought through the Quran and the examples that are given in the Quran and our understanding of what a life filled with ethics looks like. And that's how I see it.
A very practical question for you. This is quite a different question to anything that we've discussed today. How does a Muslim live a life built on the Quran today? Give us a practical 1 minute. This is something that we can snip and put up. Think of it like that. Young Muslim listening to you, for your call for justice, how would you interact with the Quran? Or how would you interact or advise someone to interact with the Quran in order to make it a lived document, a book of ethics as much as it is do's and don'ts? Like, how do you think a young Muslim goes about that today?
I think by making sure that you understand it. So many people focus purely on the reading of the Arabic, and that's great if you are kind of conversant in classical Arabic and understand the Quran and its complexities, which I don't think most people do. But I think that, whatever language it is that you are strongest in, you find a translation of the Quran in that language. And you not only read that translation while you are reading the Quran itself, but you are actually actively in a process of tadabbur, of contemplation of what the Quran says and means. Whatever your thoughts on Sayyid Qutb, Allah yarhamahu, his fi Dalal al-Quran is still to this day, for me, as an intellectual exercise of engaging with the Quran, one of the most profound things that I've read, because not even necessarily specifically because of what he says, even though what he says is so profound, it's the exercise of engaging in a conversation with the Quran that is so profound. And so, I really encourage even my own kids all the time. I always say to them, don't just read the Quran in the Arabic. Like your Arabic isn't strong. You should be reading it in English. You should be understanding, because this is a book of guidance. If you don't know what Allah is saying to you, how are you supposed to live on this earth? How are you supposed to meet the challenges of the life in front of you if you're not understanding the guidance that Allah has told you Himself that I'm giving to you through this book? And so that's why, the Quran has to be central to our understanding of living in this world and being disobedient to oppression.
So bringing that back then to what we were talking about before, and I'm again conscious of time, so you've talked about how proximity to oppression and access to, I guess, the node of that oppression or the source of that oppression are among the criteria that you would say determine a person's responsibility or perhaps even culpability. And the burden that they have to lift off their shoulders. And, I think very, very interestingly, you mentioned that, it may be that a well-educated, university-educated, middle-class, middle-aged professional in countries like Australia, the UK, America, is more responsible than, a goat herder living in Afghanistan or whatever. And I think very few people logically would actually disagree with that. I think Islamically as well, like in terms of the access to that. So what is your intimation to them? What is your encouragement to them? How would you want such a person to change their life, bringing everything that we've said together, the Quran, and it being a lived document, it being something that has an ethics that we have sort of abandoned, the hub of repression being, the West and its sponsorship of this unbelievably tyrannical, bastard child that it gave birth to. How do we bring this all together? And what would you say? What would be your message to Muslims in those positions, which many of our listeners really will be? Like, that's our audience, right? What is their responsibility? What does, disobedience and the virtue of disobedience look like?
So I think that we have to take the Quran's injunction of "Fattakullah mastata'tum" seriously, which is to be conscious of Allah as much as we are possibly able and capable. It's something that I've learned from political prisoners, especially that they have, in very limited circumstance, where they, for some of them for decades, they've been inside in prison, speaking to them, interviewing them, learning about their lives over the last 22 years. I really got a sense for how they, in a very constricted circumstance, have always sought to worship Allah to the maximum degree they possibly can. And so that is what I encourage people. When people ask me all the time, and I have this all the time when I deliver lectures and events, they always ask me, tell me what I can do.
One question. Sorry to break you off.
Sure.
It's a really important question as well. What have you seen of these people? What in their relationship with Allah have you seen change? Because I've seen you make this point a few times on different podcasts, right? That the freest are those who are behind bars, right? They are the freest in their relationship with Allah. They are the most. Like, what have you seen? What inhibitions have they lost when they have been jailed that you see and you sort of wonder, wow, mentally and emotionally and in terms of the heart, these people are actually free? Give us some examples.
Yes, subhanallah. I wrote a book last year. We published a book with Mullah Qureshi for Pluto Press called "When Only God Can See," which is about the experiences of Muslim political prisoners that have been in the custody of the US in places like Guantanamo Bay or on the US mainland in supermax facilities. But Mullah's work in the book is on those who are held in Egyptian prisons. And it's really quite remarkable. And we're very, very clear about this. We don't want people to walk away with an incorrect understanding. Muslim political prisoners also suffer crises of faith, right? But it's about how they get through that. It's about their relationship to the Quran. It's about their relationship to the Salah. It's about their relationship to the wider world. It's about relationship to the prison authorities and their complete understanding in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. They're very, very limited circumstances. Like, for example, one prisoner I represented who was, kind of trained up by his wrists above his head and being tortured, being beaten almost to death inside a toilet, and being told by his Muslim prison guards that you're inside a toilet. He was just kept in effectively what is a nappy throughout that entire period of time. He was naked except for that, so he would end up soiling himself while he hung for weeks on end. But he prayed all of his salawat. They were telling him, you're inside a toilet, so you can't pray, you can't make adhkar, you can't do any of these things. And he did all of those things. When I asked him about it, he said that I understand that Allah's mercy is so much greater than the circumstance that I am in. That all Allah has asked me to, I have no idea what time of the day it is. I have no idea whether I'm on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever. I have no idea about any of these things. I could have prayed, and I have no concept of time and the movement of time. And so I could have prayed all of my salawat within a single hour because I had no idea how long that hour actually was, right? That for him, what was an entire day was probably only a couple of hours or something like that. And so he ends up praying all 5 salawat, right? He doesn't know if he's ended up praying 3 or 4 sets of his 5 times a day prayers in a single day, right? He has no idea about any of these things, but he believes, truly understands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy in that moment. And that's why, I do say that, political prisoners are the freest of us all, because they truly, truly understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. And there's also they're unencumbered by the dunya, and when political prisoners struggle with their Islam is when they release. They're all of them, to a person. Not a single political prisoner I've ever interviewed in 22 years of doing this work has ever said to me, my iman is higher now that I'm out than I was when I was inside prison. They always say that the peak of my iman was while I was inside.
Subhanallah.
And so we are encumbered, and it actually fits to our conversation that we're the ones who are actually jailed. We are in prison by what the dunya does to us, by all of these trappings that confine us, confine our spirit, confine our understanding of Allah's quwwah, confine our understanding of Allah's rahmah, right? All of these things, they confine us because the dunya is.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a level of profundity that's actually difficult. It's actually difficult to believe. And I mean, you've worked with and spoken to so many, and obviously Brother Muazzam is a great example. I mean, let's talk about Muazzam for a second, and of course we'll have him on at some point very soon on this one. But being a friend and a colleague, you can perhaps speak a bit more freely than he would himself. But because he's someone so relatable to so many people in the West, very, very well-known figure. How does he reflect on that experience of Guantanamo Bay and the length of imprisonment and the seeming futility and hopelessness? What did that do to him? Someone like him, for example, someone that we can actually know and say that we all know.
I mean, all of these things leave scars, right? Like nobody walks away completely unencumbered by their experience. Marsden will tell you himself about how, he even like kind of on a ref on a Charles Dickens novel. He Tale of Two Cities. He writes about how Guantanamo was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Like it's that whole thing about like what does it mean to take meaning from a place like that? And he's such a great example of that. And he will tell you himself that, relatively speaking to many of the other prisoners, he was there for a very short period of time in Guantanamo Bay. He was there for 3 years. You can say, compare it to people like Mansour al-Dayfi and others. We're talking about like 15, in some cases now we're getting up to 20 years at Guantanamo Bay. It changes your relationship to the entire world. I met two brothers who were released after pretty much 20 years to Pakistan, and they were desperate to go back. They were desperate to go back inside prison. They were like, being in freedom is hell. It's an absolute hell for us. We would happily go back to Guantanamo Bay because of just how wretched the dunya actually is. Their lives were miserable, and one of them, Allah yarhamuh, who passed away recently, then after spending so long inside prison, and they were broken in so many ways by their torture. And we haven't built a capacity to envelop these people, as we should, as our heroes, back into our fold, because unfortunately, again, it's the dunya. We haven't built a political structure, an economic structure, a social structure that is able to encompass these people and really hold them and help them as we should.
Is there sort of, it's a bit of a tangent to today's topic, but in their cases, is that the psychological impact of being out of jail, the sense of feeling out of place, being back in real life, or is it really the sense of they experienced a reliance on Allah that we can only dream of, and that they just saw the delusion of this dunya when they got out? Like, where would you place it? Is it a bit of both, or how would you describe it?
It's definitely a bit of both. For sure, both of those things are going on at the same time. But it's also in the mundane, right? Like, you've been in prison for however many years. Maybe your wife was pregnant when you were picked up, and because of your kidnapping by the Americans, you never met your youngest child. Now, imagine that period of time that you're away from this child without any human contact. Let's say, for example, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And you're meeting this child for the very, very first time in your life. And some of the brothers have told me specifically that I had to fake affection for this child because I had no emotional connection to this child whatsoever. Like we take for granted living in this dunya, like how much of a blessing it is to be able to hold your own baby, to develop bonds of affection, of love, of care, of compassion. Like that physical touching, that physical intimacy is a huge part of the nurturing process. And you take somebody outside of that, and you deny them the ability to touch, and it's devastating, the consequence. Like these brothers have to fake. And I'm sure the children probably, I haven't interviewed the children about what it means for them, but so many brothers have expressed to me that we have to fake our love for our own children because we don't know what it means to be affectionate towards them, the ones that especially the ones that they never spent time with. The one that they did spend some time with, it was much easier for them to come back and feel that same sense, because they had that longing, they had that physical intimacy that they were able to connect to when they came out. But the ones that they never met, or the ones that were extremely young, when they're like just, newly borns or whatever, like it's devastating. So something as simple as a hug carries such a profound meaning and has such devastating consequences for these brothers when they get out. So it's not easy. It's not easy, which is why, for many of them, prison was easier. Like, it's easy dealing with like these, like, kind of Islamophobic, disbelieving people who are detaining you because of your faith, because their hatred and their animosity towards your faith. You put up all these walls. You learn how to protect yourself. You learn how to fight them. You learn how to force them to respect you because of your religion. You end up becoming their confidant, because their lives are miserable, and all of a sudden the dynamic has changed, where they're coming to you, talking to you about their girlfriend, talking to you about their husband, talking to you about like all the different mashakil that they have in their lives, right? Like, it's a completely different environment. Like, the amount of dawah that's going on inside prison, because Muslim political prisoners are not criminals.
Muslims, don't they? Yeah,
they do. They're not criminals. They're the ideal. They're actually the ideal prisoners. The only times that they kick up is when you abuse their rights. Right. Otherwise, Muslim political prisoners are ideal prisers. They're the best of, like, people actually, like, I've spent so many guards over the years who said that we actually enjoy, like, being the guards for Muslim political prisoners, because they're so well behaved, they're so well mannered. There's no lewdness. They don't make lewd comments at female guards. They don't like act inappropriately, or
they're there for different reasons.
They're there for different reasons. Exactly.
Arguably, they gave their lives for a particular cause, and it takes a certain level of taqwa and fearlessness to do that. Arguably, to bring everything together, inshallah, today, and very much sort of reflecting on this quite profound notion of sort of letting the dunya go. One thing that haunts me is, the cries of the children of Gaza. And the mothers and the fathers, and when they actually say, and even their spokespeople say, that that they will hold the Muslim Ummah to account on the Day of Judgment, right? That your silence, that your complicity, sometimes is directed at, even recently was directed at scholars. I mean, I'm sure exactly, the statement of Abu Ubaidah that I'm talking about. These are haunting words. These are very haunting words. And one thing that really keeps me up at night is the idea that my brothers and sisters may, on the Day of Judgment, hold me to account for not having done enough. How do you deal with this practically? And I mean, short of direct action, where you really put the proverbial on the line, how does a Muslim get even close to absolving themselves of their responsibility in a very practical way? I know you're trying through your work. I'm trying through this work. We'll have to find something that we can say, put in front of Allah and say, "Ya Allah, this was the little I could do. Please forgive me, but this is the little that I could do." What is your encouragement to our average brother and sister watching this, from a really sort of deep perspective of the purpose for which we were created, and how we get this monkey off our back, if for no other reason than to have an excuse in front of Allah? How would you encourage us to think, and what should we be doing?
I had not just me, a group of most, I would say, like, senior / well-respected kind of Muslim activists in the UK. I had a meeting with the young Ghazan journalist Abu Bakr Abid, who lives in Ireland right now. He was a sports journalist before the genocide kicked off. He has a particular penchant for football, but he kind of became a war journalist because of the genocide. And he just a few months ago moved to Ireland. He was actually able to get out in order to be able to carry on his work. Unfortunately, because his not just his life, but the life of his family became under threat. Like, they were effectively being targeted because of him being so vocal. He sat with us, and I've never been so humiliated in my life as I was at the end of that meeting, and rightly so. He asked us, or whether or not we were giving, if we were sacrificing to the point that it hurt, or whether or not we were just doing what we could with the excess of what we had, what was easy for us. And I think that's really that was one of the conversations that really hit very, very hard, very, very, very hard. And even like one of the sisters, in fact, the one that I'm going to be visiting today, inshallah, who's inside prison, she said the same thing, which is, what is it that we're actually sacrificing? Because a sacrifice isn't giving what is easy. A sacrifice is the thing that hurts you, right? So what is it that we're actually sacrificing for Gaza? I say to people all the time that like there's nothing prescriptive about this. If you are an artist, right, who's very, very good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you a talent that He hasn't given the rest of us. How are you using that artwork right now in order to further this cause, in order to highlight this cause, right? If you are an exceptional researcher, how are you using those research skills? If you're exceptional at any area, if you have certain gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you, how is it? You might be an entrepreneur. How have you made the intention to Allah about increasing the capacity of your entrepreneurial skills, building businesses, building wealth, so that you can give back in ways that are just for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone? Because that is a skill that, for example, I don't have. Like, I don't know how to make money. Like, I just simply don't. It's not a skill set that I have. Not even a desire that I have. But some people are very good at it. They are genuinely very good at it. So the question for them is that you were given a specific skill by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How have you maximized that skill for His sake alone and for the oppressed? And that's what I keep on coming back to people with. Every time they ask me, what can I do? I'm like, what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you? What did He inform you about what you should be doing? Because, for those of us who have like university degrees and whatever else, by the time we get to that stage, we kind of know what we're good at. So we should be maximizing that to whatever effect that we can. We should be losing sleep. We should be, kind of doing what we can to the absolute nth degree that we could possibly can. Are we living our lives in a way that shows Ghazans that we genuinely care? Even if we're going out and celebrating things with our family and going to a whatever else, are we at least a little bit cognizant of what is happening in Gaza, that we have a bit of shame to say, I'm not going to post this thing publicly because I feel shy. I feel shy for a Ghazan seeing it, right? And so it's not about not necessarily having joy in your life. It's about just having that literal switch in your head where you are living your life in a way that you're aware of the feelings of others. I think that's important.
And I mean, at the end of the day, and we've had many deep, profound conversations here in our circles. It's the sense that if we truly understand the hadith of the Muslim Ummah being like one body, it's like, what sort of emotion does that evoke really? And you just think of what you would be willing to do if your family member was going through that. Literally, what would you do, right? If your mother or father was killed tomorrow mercilessly, and if we don't find ourselves perturbed in that way, then I think then there's something there. There's something there that needs work. It needs work at a very deep spiritual level, and the dunya has got us, and there's no way around that except for very deep work and reconnection with Allah. And I think the Quran is the only thing that can open that door, and the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I think to your point about that deep tadabbur and reflection, I think that's the only way we can get there. It's the only hope that we have to wake us up.
Absolutely.
Brother Asim, Jazakallah khair. It's been a wonderful conversation, very, very deep. It's gonna have it's late night in Australia, but I can tell you, I don't think I'll be sleeping anytime soon. It's a lot of food for thought, and there's a lot that we all need to think of at an individual level in order to then have that collective impact. I really appreciate the conversation that you've had with us today. I'm sure many other people will as well. It's hopefully the start of a great relationship with you, and we look forward to having you again and unpeeling the layers of the onion. We didn't get to talk about things like direct action too much today, which I really wanted to speak to, but I think there is something there, and I think we've referred enough in terms of what holds us back and what are we afraid of that we don't partake in it. And I think people can make their own conclusions that when we've got different capacities and different things that we can give and different impacts we can have, then that absolutely is an avenue that all of us need to very much look into. But Any parting thoughts? Any sort of top of mind things that you would say we need to keep in mind as we interact with this and see what's panning out day by day, week by week? Any final thoughts from you?
No, I think Jazakumullah khair, we covered a lot. Yeah, maybe the only thing I'd say is just we should all try and live our lives in a way that we have an excuse before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah. We're implicated by the world that we live in. So let's all of us together, inshallah, try our best to find that excuse before him, bin ta'ala.
Inshallah. May Allah make it easy for us, forgive us for our ample shortcomings towards our brothers and sisters, and give us an excuse on the day when, our brothers and sisters will hover right over us, and just as our own families do, so will they. And if we don't strive, then it's a very scary prospect as to what could happen. It's a very somber note to ponder. But inshallah khair, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of all things, and he can set it all right in one moment, and we have inshallah confidence in him that we will within our lifetimes. Inshallah. Jazakallah khair, dear Brother Asim. Thank you so much for your time. May Allah reward you. Brothers and sisters, do check out Brother Asim's amazing work. Dr. Asim, I should say. Cage, very well known, very easy to find. Brother Asim Qureshi on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment to our channels, our fledgling channels, which we hope to become a greater voice for the people of Palestine and for our Ummah more broadly. We look forward to catching you in our next episode. Until then, جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.